Welcome, thanks. Thanks for having me to talk a little bit about policy development in the internet governance context. There's lots of policy development bodies in internet governance, and so there isn't some monolithic place in which policy for the internet gets developed, right? I mean, there's different kinds of policies, as you learned from some of the speakers, from David Gross, from Milton. There's some policy that's developed by governments, for example, that has to do with national policy with respect to the internet. There are standards bodies, right, that develop rules and best practices for how information is exchanged on the internet. And because we're here in San Juan for the ICANN meeting, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the ICANN policy development process. So ICANN is responsible, on the one hand, for a very simple part of the internet, which is just the names and addresses and policies around them. And at their core, the concept is simply that if I type a name into a browser, that the website I'm expecting is the one that will appear. Really, that's it, in a way. And when you go a level down and figure out all the ways that could turn out not to be the case, is when it gets complicated, right? I mean, what happens if I misspell a name? And then I'm taken someplace that looks like the website I'm looking for. You know, what kinds of names can different people have? And Milton touched on a little bit in terms of trademark owners and things like that. And so it's one level down from that basic question of, did I get to the place I thought I would when I typed the name, right? And it's answering those questions below that adds complexity to policy development. And it's one of those exponential complexity. In other words, it should be very simple, and as soon as you add a little bit of complexity, it turns out to be a lot. So I thought I would talk a little bit about ICANN policy development, because it gets discussed a lot in the international space because a couple of reasons. One is that there's a lot of participation at ICANN. There's a lot of money at ICANN that a lot of people have their eyes on, kind of. And but it's also interesting in that it's one of the few instances in which many different types of stakeholders get together to discuss policy. So in most instances, policy development happens among certain stakeholders, people of a certain category, whether it's governments or industry, etc. Industry gets together and develops standards, governments gets together and develops laws, etc. And then you have ICANN, where you just crowd everybody into the same room and tell them to develop policy. And it is difficult. So ICANN policy development is basically done by these so-called supporting organizations inside of ICANN. And perhaps the most visible of which is called the Generic Name Supporting Organization, or GNSO. There's also the Country Code Names Supporting Organization, which is all of the domains that end in country codes that have their own policy development process. And then there's the Address Supporting Organization, which is organizations that manage the numbering and address spaces of the internet. And so most of my experience has been in the GNSO. In fact, I was, for many years, part of the intellectual property constituency inside of ICANN and represented the interests of small businesses that were concerned about how their name might be used on the internet and what the implications of that are. There are also advisory committees. I left off a very important one called the GAC, or the Government Advisory Committee. There's the At-Large Advisory Committee that I'm a part of now, and the Security and Stability Advisory Committee, that are groups of people that are often from across different stakeholders that have particular interests that they're trying to provide input about, etc., and they advise the board on policy. But policy itself gets developed within the supporting organizations, and then is ultimately then approved by the board of ICANN. So if you look at the multi-stakeholder policy development process, this is an actual infographic that came out of ICANN for each of these different types of supporting organizations, the GNSO, the Country Code Organization, and the Address Supporting Organization, you can see there's very similar and yet distinct practices for developing policy and how that process looks for creating policy inside of those organizations. And I want to focus on the GNSO policy development process. And this is actually probably, looks like it's going to be harder than it should be for you to read from the back of the room. I apologize. But basically, this is done through the formation of working groups. And so what happens at first is that a request is made by the board for the staff of ICANN to come up with a kind of a white paper, if you will, to describe the problem that needs to be addressed, and to do a little bit of initial research into that, to justify the creation of a working group in the community to establish policy around that particular topic. And after that, a working group is formed. And so a working group is made up of volunteers from across the community. So even though this working group is officially sanctioned by the generic name supporting organization, anybody can be a part of it. You can sign up to be a part of any working group inside of ICANN if you want to, and participate on the calls, be part of the conversations, etc., that are part of developing that policy. And so the first thing that that working group does is take this issue paper that's created by the staff, and from that develop a kind of charter for that working group. So they try to figure out what are the parameters of what we're trying to discuss here. And sometimes the discussion of the parameters of the discussion is bigger than the discussion of the problem itself. Because one of the complexities inside of ICANN is really trying to figure out what the boundaries should be of the conversation, and who it is that we actually have jurisdiction over when we're setting policy, and what information we should bring in, etc. And so one of the trickiest questions sometimes is to refer back to the underlying purpose for ICANN, right, which is just managing these addresses, and making sure that what policy we're developing, that we're trying to implement through ICANN, adheres to its underlying mission. And so that's one of the most difficult questions, and so that's the one that gets addressed when these working groups form these charters to try and figure out what the parameters will be of the policy that they're attempting to develop. So then once that charter is developed, then the working group starts its operation in specific, and begins to, first of all, reach out to the community as a whole and ask for feedback. So you often develops a set of questions that it tries to put out to the community, the internet community as a whole, which could be people within ICANN, but also organizations with which they're familiar that are outside of ICANN, businesses that might be interested, anyone that they can get feedback on this issue, they go out and reach out to the community to receive that feedback, to get them started in terms of where people's interests lie in the creation of this specific policy. Once that happens, they often try to commission some research themselves. So they'll go out and try to answer some of the questions, try to figure out what it is that's taking place, supplement, these questions are asked with individual surveys or interviews, etc., to try and determine what the nature of the problem is, the scope of the problem, etc. And sometimes an outside firm will be hired to help with that research. For example, one of the questions that is a very hot topic inside of ICANN right now relates to who is, which is this idea of how much information about yourself are you sharing with the public when you register a domain. So if you decide to register a domain that's called, jonathansphotographs.com, right now I have to say that I'm the one that's registering this domain. Here's my contact information. Here's the person that's going to be administering my website, which is a little bit of an outdated concept, and what their contact information is, etc. And so that information began as a way for people to just reach out and say, hey, I'm having a problem getting to your website, and I can contact you and let you know that your website's down, or that you know, I'm getting a missing page or something like that, and it's become a very important source of information for law enforcement. It becomes a source of information for you know, folks that are concerned about the content on the site, like intellectual property holders that want to reach out and say, why do you have my movie on your site? You know, things like that. And so this idea of being able to reach out to people directly has become a very hot topic inside of the internet. And it's become even more complicated because of recent legislation or reaffirmation of legislation in Europe about privacy and whether or not people should have the ability to have a website and be totally anonymous in the things that they publish. Because certainly if I'm a dissident and I'm trying to publish things that are against my government, I don't want to put out my contact information. Here's where to come arrest me, right? Or to reach out to me. And so where do I draw those lines, and where do I? And so those are some of the kinds of issues that folks look into. And so you can see how this small, simple issue of the website I typed in is the one that showed up in my browser can very quickly blow up into an enormous conversation, right? And that's why sometimes the policy development process inside of ICANN can take years. Each one of these working groups can go on for multiple years before, and I think who is policy has been hotly debated for about 20 years now and not completely resolved. But this new issue in Europe may draw a very hard line in the sand that will require some resolution sooner rather than later. So there'll be some outside firms. So for example, the working group might hire a firm to figure out what the level is of accuracy in the WHOIS database. You know, to try and figure out what the nature of the problem is. Is it really a problem of accuracy? Well, it turns out that it's not that accurate, right? So that establishes a problem. And then the question becomes, whose responsibility is it for it to be accurate? And what are the implications of enforcing that responsibility on the ISPs and the registrars that maintain that information, right? And as Milton said, there's always this notion of how can I reach out to the fewest number of people to affect change, right? So the idea is if I've got a whole bunch of people that are doing something wrong, I don't want to have to knock on all of their doors or call all their telephones. What I want to do is find some small group of people that are already talking to them and somehow make it their responsibility, right? So I'm always trying to find some consolidated actor, right? Which is, you know, why employers have to pay your taxes for you, for example, right? Let me find the smallest group possible that I then am enforcing against and give the responsibility to others then to reach out to the individual end users, and that has its own complexity as well. Somebody had a question? Yeah?
I'm just having some issue with the concept that ICANN will ask some firms to do something and they get some profit out of that. Is it in conflict with a multi-stakeholder type? And also, I understand that business is one of the one of the multi-stakeholders. But what I understand is that they should come freely and participate. And this will reflect non-biased idea or something like that. But when you give special people a special task and you ask them to finish it, how can you show that there is no bias?
Jonathan, we actually didn't hear the question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, I'll do my best to. So there were a couple of questions, and one is, I think the first question was about ICANN being involved in setting policy that affects its own revenue. That it's setting policy that can change the amount of money that comes into ICANN. And is there a conflict of interest associated with that?
Yeah.
I think that was the first question. And then the second question had to do with stakeholders coming together and some of them having specific interests in how do you prevent bias of the people that are coming to talk, right? And those are very big questions. And I guess in both cases, you hope that the volume of participants becomes the best cure, if possible, for bias. By having as many people involved in looking at the budget of ICANN, looking at how that money gets spent, etc., then you minimize the impact of a bias of a particular actor, right? I mean, right now, for example, there's an open public comment for ICANN for their next year's budget, right? That everyone has an opportunity to participate in and to provide comments on, and there's a process for interacting with the ICANN organization about the budget. There's now, since the most recent transition of the last little bit of U.S. control over ICANN that happened very recently, there's a new accountability framework inside of ICANN as well, with the express purpose of preventing ICANN from becoming like FIFA, right? I mean, that was the example that people would use, right? We don't want ICANN to become FIFA, right? Exactly. And so the question then is, how do you do that? And so there was a lot of work, a couple of years worth of work, about creating an accountability mechanism that allows the community to push back and veto the budget even. So if the normal process of interaction on the budget fails, the community is empowered to go and veto the budget. And bring it back for discussion again. So things like that act as a kind of check and balance rather than trying to individually root out bias, right? Everyone who participates is supposed to fill out a document called a statement of interest so that they share their bias, right? This is what I do, this is my bias, right? And so there's some element of that. So a lot of the bias is obvious, which is helpful, right? You still want everybody to participate even if they have a bias, but if they wear a badge that says, here's my bias, then it becomes less powerful and less dark in that way, right? And so the idea is that I have as many people participating, I have as much transparency in the process as possible, and I now have these new mechanisms that we haven't tried yet, really, but that would allow the community, if they really felt that the board of ICANN was doing something they shouldn't, they have the ability to pull it back now through a veto of the budget, for example, as well. And Marilyn, I think, wants to supplement my answer.
Yeah. So, Marilyn Kate speaking, when we set ICANN up, we were very concerned about ICANN becoming the trade association for the contracted parties. Now, at the time, there was one registry called NSI that's now VeriSign, and 5 competitive registrars plus the CCTLDs. But as the number of registries grew and the number of registrars grew, we had to create, and legal teams that worked for many of the businesses devoted a lot of time to trying to figure out how you were going to safeguard against this capture issue that you just mentioned. So we set up this, the idea that the community is a balance to the contracted parties. It is a concern that many of us have because people's roles are morphing. And we do have 2 approaches to think about. One is the statement of interest, and the other is a conflict of interest. Having an interest does not necessarily mean you have a conflict, but you need to really think about what your conflict of interest is. We used to have a requirement in the previous, with the previous general counsel, that when you went to the microphone, you had to open your comments with your name and whether or not you had a contract. And that has dropped away with Fadi Shahadi's, the previous CEO, and this one. And it might not be a bad thing because we've grown from 350 attendees, where I knew every one of them, right, to over 2,000, 2,500. And you don't
Where you only know 2,200 of them.
Actually, Jonathan, just real quickly, for the first 3 days of every ICANN meeting, I take double doses of my high blood pressure medicine because there's at least 300 people that don't know me yet.
Right.
But to my point, I think Jonathan is making a point to you that I hope you're really understanding. It's very scary to get on a list and be a newbie. So find a spirit guide that you can ask the questions of privately while you build your skills, and you can become a contributor, because your voice is actually probably more important than you might be thinking it is.
Anyone else?
My name is Christina. So you said that ICANN policy development takes a lot of time. Starting from May 1, GDPR is go live, yes? So does it mean that ICANN policy development will go to another long time development?
Yes, thank you for your question. The question's about the GDPR, which is the privacy law in Europe that is supposed to go live on May 1st. And it's certainly causing a level of urgency that is not normally seen inside the ICANN community. People are moving more quickly than they normally do. But the secret is that even though they're going public on May 1st, I think if they see that activity, they're not going to immediately start enforcing, right? I mean, European government is famous for symbolic launches of things and then taking a while to really get to enforcement, right? And so I think that the fact that the community is actively engaged will make a big difference in how that law is enforced on ICANN as an organization and on the individual contracted parties that Marilyn talked about, which she's talking about the registries and the registrars that might be affected, and that policy, as long as people are actively engaged. Now, at the same time, there are things happening behind the scenes. So, for example, individual registrars are in some instances developing their own policy and ignoring what's going on at ICANN to make sure that they're covered, right? Because if you're big enough to have a lawyer, your lawyer is telling you you should develop a policy and not wait. And so there are some individual policies that are being developed. ICANN itself has tried to is developing an interim policy by itself before the community gets involved because of how long it takes the community to do its work. And so that, of course, has the community freaking out, right? You know, so it's this difficult to win situation. But it makes sense for them as an organization because they are themselves, as an organization, potentially falling under enforcement actions. So they need to act as an organization separately than as a community as well to define policy for themselves. And they've come up with an interim policy that they've had open discussions about, et cetera, and they will put out for a kind of public comment soon, but they're trying to make that happen fairly quickly so that they are covered as an organization, and then they will ask the community to launch a work group process that may take 2 years to come up with a long-term policy for the organization to address the interim policy. And I think all of that activity will be obvious to the database authorities, the data authorities in Europe, who are going to see that and go, okay, they're not just ignoring it, they're trying to find a way to comply. So I don't expect there to be huge enforcement actions within the ICANN community, come May 1st. So that's a very specific policy that a lot of people are talking about right now, and it's going to fundamentally change, the discussions that we've been having about who for many, many years. And so in that sense, it could be a good thing, because it could break we call it a log jam, right? It break the binding that was keeping that policy from getting fully developed. So, so then what happens is that when I'll just go back into my process here, and you'll see the cycles that it kind of goes through. Once the work group comes out with a policy proposal, that is then placed up for public comment as well. And by public comment, again, I mean anyone that's interested in the world can make a public comment. And so then the work group reads all of those comments and tries to see if they can accommodate them, if they disagree with them, or if they should make a change to their proposal based on the comment. And then they put out a final report, and that goes to the board. And then sometimes the board does another public comment period, and then before making a decision, and then finally the board implements the policy out through the staff. And so that's the overall policy process inside of ICANN. So you can see there's a lot of requests for information, requests for feedback, etc. along the way that are designed to make sure that no opinion is going unheard. Doesn't mean there aren't opinions that get ignored sometimes, because everyone's human, but there's at least mechanisms for voices to be heard. Something that's a kind of recent development, depending on who you ask, right? Inside of ICANN is to try and make policy development a little bit more data-driven. And so right now, there are parts of the process for the staff paper that I talked about, the study, the charter, and the policy development template. Each of them now have sections associated with the collection of data around that policy. The idea being that you would use it basically for three things. One is to quantify the problem in the first place. So to the extent possible, if you are saying that whois accuracy is a problem, then start with a number that says here's the accuracy, so that you can then as a work group set as a goal to double the accuracy or something like that, right? So that when you then propose a solution, you're able to use, again, data for defining metrics for success. So if I've now said that here's my policy I'm proposing, I believe this policy will result in doubling the accuracy of the whois database, that means later on I can go see if the policy worked. And so we went back and looked at a lot of policies. In most cases, nobody looks back again until they've had a whole new policy development process. There's no process by saying, is what we're doing working? And so the idea then being that I can take these measures for success, look at it periodically to see if the trend is going the right way, and make a change if it's not. And so instead of just saying, here's a policy based on people's opinions about what's going on, and we'll give it a try, and then give it a try for 8 years, and then later on try to figure out whether it worked, we try to see on a regular basis, is it trending in the right way, so that we can make a course correction later if it isn't. And so that process is now on paper baked into all the stages of the policy development process inside of ICANN. So it still remains to be seen how it gets implemented, but it's now at least baked in. And there's more data coming out of ICANN as well. There's an open data initiative inside of ICANN to where they're trying to find good ways to publish more data so that work groups and others that are trying to advocate for policy within ICANN have data to use for the advocacy of that policy. So that's an exciting development inside of ICANN. And then the other thing I wanted to just draw your attention to that's very new is that ISOC has started something called the Collaborative Governance Project that's being run by Larry Strickling, who used to be head of a Department of Commerce department called the NTIA. He's sort of like the lead liaison between the U.S. government and ICANN, and was responsible for letting go of that last thread of control of ICANN as well. So he's somewhat famous for that. But also attempted within the Department of Commerce to execute some multi-stakeholder policy development on things like privacy policies, drones, interactive advertising, etc. So they tried to do some multi-stakeholder policy development while at the Department of Commerce as well. And so this organization is something that's part of ISOC, and they're trying to create opportunities to use the multi-stakeholder policy development process outside of ICANN and in other areas. So if it's something that's of interest, I recommend going to their site. There's a paper that they did a study, and they're looking for potential projects to use as pilot projects as well. So that's something to reach out about as well. So that's the overall process. I was told that in order not to censor Milton, that I had to be censored. So that's the way censorship works. And so I'll open it up for any other questions that you have about this, and otherwise I'm done. Thank you.
Hi, just quickly about the collaborative governance project. So how diverse are the stakeholders there? I suppose there's no governmental stakeholders in that, or could there be?
There certainly can be. I mean, that's the goal. And it would depend on the particular policy being developed whether or not they would be an interested stakeholder. They're not always going to be interested. But this is just a nonprofit that's hoping to help be a place to congregate to do policy development of all the stakeholders who are interested. So sometimes it involves government, sometimes it won't, but it definitely government's welcome, because that's part of the model that Larry Strickland in particular came from. And so there's nobody trying to block the government. The idea is for each individual discussion, who are the stakeholders, and get them all in the room, and that's what they're trying to be an agent for.
So has anything happened there yet in that group?
Just a study.
Oh.
It's very, very new. They just did a study of existing multi-stakeholder decision-making processes, including ICANN, including the things the Department of Commerce, and some things around the world. And they published a paper, and now they've created this institute, basically, that hopes to be a venue and an agent for creating multi-stakeholder policy development processes. But it's brand new, and to my knowledge, they haven't had a pilot project yet.
What's the name of the institute?
The Collaborative Governance Project as part of ICANN.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we've made some tentative moves to bring a particular project to Larry and see how this works out. It is internet governance related. I think one of the possible criticisms that might be made of this project is that he thinks that the multi-stakeholder model can be applied anywhere, which may be true, but the expertise and capacity required to bring it into water resources in, the American Southwest, or some kind of problems in, the former Soviet satellite republics, I think is way outside of their reach, and I think they could get into trouble if they try to stretch it too far. I hope they try to stick to internet governance.
Good point, or grow slowly, or something like that. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, and actually, privilege. As a matter of fact, tomorrow afternoon, for those that are interested in asking questions to the CEO and President, Kathy Brown, she'll be here with us tomorrow afternoon. So you can ask her how she expects this to evolve, okay? So feel free to ask her.
Great.
Anybody else has any questions?
She had a comment?
Oh, yes.
You had it, you said you had it as a PowerPoint
So
presentation?
I had a question about the process of policymaking and how diverse that process can be, because I feel like this process is kind of different from whatever goes within the constituencies within ICANN. So I just wanted, and again, sorry, my name's Helen. This is the first time I'm getting in touch with internet governance. So I just wanted to understand what are the different processes that there can be for policymaking, because I feel like this is collaborative, and even though there is a multi-stakeholder factor in all of them, I just wanted to get a better understanding of what are the approaches towards it, maybe.
Okay. There's a bunch of interest groups
Thank you.
inside of ICANN, constituencies, right, that you mentioned. And in many ways, you can think of them as groups who have declared their bias.
Okay.
Right? These are the people we represent. I'm the intellectual property constituency. I represent copyright and trademark holders. And I'm not apologizing for that, right? That's who I represent. And I represent registrars. And my primary interest is to try and register as many domains as possible. That's how I make my money. I'm not apologizing for that, right? I represent registries. I represent the business constituency. So the business constituency are people that that register a lot of domains for their business. And I'm not apologizing for that. And so in each of those constituencies, I develop my position. In other words, here's what we think is important to us. Here's where we think we can compromise, right? Here's where we can't compromise. This is where we need to keep fighting. right? And I develop a basket of positions. And now I'm sent as a representative of my constituency to go be in a working group. And in that working group, I do my best to represent my constituency, but my voice is not any more important than everyone else that's in the working group. So I just have to get by on charm, right? So that's why Milton does so well in that working group process. So, exactly. And so now there is a definite advantage for people that are native speakers of English still inside of ICANN. That's definitely, so that's a different kind of constituency, right? And so there's some advantages that happen that way. They do a lot to try and mitigate that through simultaneous translation of the documents along the way, but it's no question that in an open conversation like this, right, you still have an advantage if you're a native speaker of English, and that's still the case inside of ICANN policy development. But as far as the constituencies, there isn't so much that advantage.
So this is the first initiative to try to do it in another format, sort of.
This particular one,
Yes.
yes. No, it's not the first.
Okay.
I mean, there have been little examples, and it's an attempt to really to make it grow faster, the idea of multi-stakeholder policy development. Because if you look at the IETF, for example, they operate on a multi-stakeholder basis as well. So there's different examples of doing it. They just want to see more of them, and so they've established themselves to really promote the multi-stakeholder model. So it's the first instance, I think, of an organization whose mission is to promote multi-stakeholder decision making.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've learned in coming into this space in the policy development process is actually following a working group and looking at past records. And there's some groups that have finished, or that they have, everything's documented online, and that you have access to these files. So I'm wondering, since you've had a lot of experience, what would you recommend for newcomers to this space to become familiar with this process by being able to go through the archives and listen? I mean, if you have a lot of time, you can do this. But I think for me, it's been really helpful to follow some working groups. So I was wondering, if there are some accessible working groups that newcomers to the space might be able to use as a way to become familiar with what can be a really complex process.
That's a great question.
I mean, it's a terrific question, and it's a very open, ongoing discussion within ICANN how to better accommodate a newcomer, or even if not a newcomer, a more periodic participant, because not everyone has Maryland's ability to know 2,200 people and 5,200 policy issues and things like that. It's an all or nothing proposition for some people, right? It's what you do for a living now is to be in internet governance policy development, and not everyone can afford for that to be the case. And so that continues to be difficult. And so, I mean, there are some efforts to try to figure out how to produce summaries, to boil things down so that people that want to just look at a particular issue of interest to them can more easily see what's going on with that issue. Reading the archives is still a pretty arduous task, but I think that it's worth looking at the stages. In other words, the staff paper that got created about the policy, the charter, the initial report, the public comments, and the final report. You can start to see what the work product was. But the process is available to you as well. You can go listen to recordings of meetings that took place, etc., and you can make that your new life, right? And so you can just ask my wife about conference calls at 3 o'clock in the morning that go on for 2 hours, and so it can be crazy and intimidating. And I think that the onus is on the ICANN community to find ways to make periodic participation more effective, so that we're hearing from people that are able to bring a unique perspective about a particular thing rather than a generalist's perspective on internet governance. And so that's an ongoing challenge. It's not been solved. It's an ongoing conversation. Come be a part of that conversation.
I can actually add to that. I'm an ICANN 60 fellow. and I've been involved with ICANN since ICANN 53, I think it is. And I still consider myself a beginner, a newcomer, trying to get involved. I'm actually working in some of the working groups. I'm chairing some working groups already, thanks to Sira Nushin. I think she's going to talk about that, especially for the ICANN fellows and the newcomers, to give you a perspective and idea of what's coming in the ICANN meeting.
Hello, sir. My name is Soya Filomena. So I was wondering, because you mentioned about copyright and you have a background in cinematography, right? So right now I'm working with an independent CGI film. We have 350 artists from DreamWorks Pixar Illumination Studio. It's called Mila. It's about the collateral damage of war in children, and our director is Steve Sangelini, which you guys might know because of Minions. And I wanted to know if your background as, you know, a cinematographer relates to this in a way.
Yeah, certainly in a way. I'm a filmmaker, an independent filmmaker, so I haven't made anything like Minions. But I did create a horror film that was available on BitTorrent before it was available on Amazon. Right? Yeah, exactly. It's called Within the Darkness. But so it you know, so it's a problem, and copyright holders are no different in a way than governments, in that they're trying to figure out the least number of people they need to deal with in order to try and solve their problem. And so they have an interest too in trying to leverage platforms and others that creates complexity around rights, because but they want to try and find a manageable number of people they can have a conversation with to try and prevent the proliferation of their content. And it's definitely an ongoing problem that is an ongoing debate, with some creative solutions and some less creative solutions that cause a lot of public controversy. Like there was a blocking bill in the United States. You heard Sopa Pippa maybe, that caused a lot of outrage, some of which was actually natural and not manufactured outrage. But there's a lot of discussion about things, and it's a tense thing because it's still a real problem for copyright holders, but at the same time, it's easy to bring a lot of dolphins into the tuna net. You know, when you try to operate with the fewest number of agents, you're going to capture too many